everybody. Welcome to BookEnds Online Edition, produced by the Wadena County Historical Society and Traveling Storyseller in collaboration with the New York Mills Regional Cultural Center. BookEnds is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Five Wings Arts Council, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. BookEnds programs from previous authors are now available on the website of the Wadena County Historical Society at www.wadenacountyhistory.org. Today's program will also be available on the website shortly. Next month's speakers are Jim and Barbara Wosick, authors of Bud's Jacket, An American Flyer Evades the Nazis in Occupied France. Next month's bookends will be held Saturday, February 12th, 2022. This month's speaker is Carolyn Porter. More than a decade ago, author and graphic designer Carolyn Porter visited a now closed antique store in downtown Stillwater, Minnesota. I have an affection for old handwriting, and I had been keeping an eye out for old letters I could use as a source material for a new computer font, said Porter. But until that day, I had not found letters that included enough raw material to work with. For her font, Porter needed a handwriting sample that had a complete array of both upper and lowercase letters, along with numbers. She found exactly what she had been looking for in a collection of letters written during World War II by a Frenchman named Marcel Heuzé. She also uncovered a mystery. In her recently released book, Marcel's Letters, A Font and the Search for One Man's Fate, Porter shares the story of her search for answers. If you have questions for today's author, feel free to enter them through chat. Now, let's give a warm welcome to BookEnds Online Edition guest author, Carolyn Porter. Welcome. Yay.
Thank you. So thank you, Lena, for contacting me for this, and thanks for the Wadena County Historical Society. What a delightful thing to do on a frigid January Saturday. I just love this idea, and I'm so grateful for organizations like you that have moved events like this online during the pandemic. So I hope you are all safe and warm today. So I'm going to tell you about the book, but I want to start with the story behind the story, because otherwise it won't make any sense why a graphic designer from Minnesota has any interest whatsoever in old French letters that I couldn't even read. So I'm a graphic designer, and that's what I went to school for. And so for nearly 30 years have been providing graphic design services to clients. And as a graphic designer, I work with type all the time and computer fonts, and I'm trained in how to make type beautiful and legible and how to communicate through type. So that's part of it, but I also really love old handwriting, which is a very obscure thing to love. I get that. But if you show me something from 1890, it is just eye candy to me. You know, I just look at these loops and swirls and inky stains. I just love looking at old handwriting. And about 25 years ago or so, I was reading an article in a design magazine that showed the very first computer font that was designed to mimic the look of old-timey handwriting. So it was scratchy and irregular, and nobody had done that before. And it was just this huge eureka moment for me. It combined typography, design, and this obscure thing that I love, this old scratchy handwriting. And I knew right then and there, I was going to do that someday. I was going to design a computer font that mimicked the look of old-timey handwriting. And part of what gave me the permission to feel like I could do this is that that font that I saw had been created by a graphic designer. And so I thought, oh, if this graphic designer could do something like that and figure it out, I can probably do that too, even though I didn't have any idea actually how do you design a computer font. So as Shelley said, I kept an eye out for what would be the perfect specimen that I could use. And so I needed to find something that had a lot of the letters that I needed. And for a while, I looked at writing of old relatives, and I just looked at different archives, and nothing was quite right. Or I would find a really beautiful sample, but it wouldn't be very complete. And so I for this first project, I felt like I needed to trace somebody else's handwriting, right? So I was in an antique store in Stillwater and found beautiful handwritten letters, and I'll show you a close-up. And I really, really love that letter M right there. It's also this letter M. I couldn't read the letters. They're written in French. I don't know French, but it didn't matter because an A in French looks like an A in English, right? So I thought I didn't need to know what the letter said. But even so, you could tell just by looking at the letter that it was written with affection, right? You wouldn't write a letter to a pharmacist or a lawyer with swirls and embellishments, right? So it seemed special, even though I couldn't read it. So one other thing that I found really interesting about the letters, you can see here, there are stripes. So I could tell that the letter was written in French, right? Even though I don't know French, you can kind of guess languages. And so I interpreted these stripes as colors of the French flag. And so there were things about these letters that were very intriguing, even though I couldn't read them. So I bought 5 letters, brought them home, scanned them in, and started figuring out how to make a font. And it was, I will say, a very slow process. There's a huge learning curve with the software. I was not efficient, and a lot of times just learned by, I say, trial and error and error and error and error. But there was joy, like get up and do the happy dance kind of joy. The very first time I hit the button A on my keyboard, and an A appeared on my screen. So even though progress was really slow, it was a project that I couldn't let go. I kept on coming back to, even though I would be so frustrated. Sometimes I'd have to set it aside, but then I would always come back. So the font was finished in 2014. It is out in the world. Anybody can license it and put it on their computer and use it and type in Marcel's handwriting. I've seen it in use on wedding invitations, in magazines, in ads. I walked into a bookstore. This was a few years ago. And you know how they have the display of recent releases right by the door? So I walked in the door, saw that it was on the cover of an Anna Quinlan book, and said really loud, "Holy bleep!" And then I looked around like, oh my gosh, what kids are around that just heard me swear inside a Barnes and Noble in, Maplewood Mall. But I don't know where I'm going to see the font, but it is, when I see it in use, it is always just something that just makes my heart skip a little bit. Oh, I also recently saw it was printed on a COVID mask. So of course I had to, go online to figure out who was selling it, and then I bought one. And so anyway, going back to before the font was done in 2011, at that point I had been working on the font for 9 years. And I knew who had written the letter because I could see a signature at the bottom of the letter. I could see it had been written by a man named Marcel. But I realized I didn't know anything about him. I knew his handwriting intimately. I knew every nick and every curve of every letter of the alphabet, but I didn't know anything about him. So kind of on a whim, I decided to have a letter translated. And at that point, it was just a fun curiosity, right? I thought, well, let's see what this letter that I've been looking at has to say. So I'm going to read the first letter to you. So this is the first letter that was translated, and it is this letter, the letter with the beautiful M. So the date was March 21st. It didn't have a year. Sunday at 3 o'clock. You can tell mom that today I'm eating the last of the beans and that she can send some more. Love and kisses from Papa to everyone. That's the little note at the top of the letter. My dear little girls, today it's springtime and the weather is excellent. This afternoon, Matardier should come to see me, so while waiting for him, I'll reply to your very kind letter, which pleased me very much. Before writing to you, I did my laundry. Once it's dry, I will have quite a bit of mending to do. It would be great to have one of you two with me. So I see you had a good time at Mardi Gras. I hope you didn't scare Lily or little Jacqueline. In the meantime, you should go pick violets in the nearby woods. This morning, I had some bad luck. While combing my hair, my comb broke in my hand. You can tell mom that she can send me another one. Denise, I would like to receive a letter from you so you can tell me what you did in Monterey. Did you go to the movies with mom? Did you go shopping by yourself? And what about you, Suzanne? Were you the one getting milk and bread while mom was in Paris? As for Lily, I'm glad she's no longer sucking her thumb. I recommend she doesn't pick blossoms from the cherry tree or the pear trees. She should wait until the fruit is ripe. My dear little ones, I don't have much else to tell you today. I recommend that you be on your best behavior. Please give my love to your mother. Hug her a lot, and the same for Grandma too. Your Papa who sends his love from 1,300 kilometers away. Your Papa who thinks about you all the time. Signed, Papa. So that was interesting. Not what I had expected for sure, because over the 9 years I'd been working on the font, I just kind of presumed it was a letter from a man to his wife or girlfriend, and that it would be full of, flowery words of love. But he's talking about laundry and food and being far away, and that was not what I had expected for sure. So I had the second letter translated. And at this point, it was more than a month had passed, and it was still a fun curiosity, right? And I just had the letter translated one at a time because I had to pay for the translations out of my own pocket, and it had not yet become an obsession. But I had the second letter translated, and that for me changed everything. So I'm going to read you just a couple excerpts of the letter. At the top of the letter, there's a swastika that says, for the class and by the will of God, hugs and kisses from Papa who thinks about you a lot. Signed, Papa. So that's a little note to his girls. But this letter was written to his wife. My darling, today, Sunday, it's 1:30 and I'm in the barracks with Marcel, Mamil, and Bernard. We don't know what to do, so with Marcel, we decided to write. The weather is terrible. 1 minute, some beautiful sun that invites us to go for a walk, but a few minutes later, it starts snowing. I wanted to go to the movies, but then, because we're not sure we can get tickets, I stayed here. Mamil is in the corner by the fire like an old grandfather, and he sings to us the Song of the Mason by Maurice Chevalier. In a little while, there'll be a soccer game behind the camp. If the weather holds, I'll go for a walk over there. Yesterday, I sent you a card, but the mail lady didn't feel like working. And when I went to the post office to mail the letters, she was gone. So the mail won't go out until Monday. Today is the 12th, exactly 14 months since I started working at Daimler. For the past week, we've been living the good life. I should explain a little bit. In the square, there's a guy from Amiens who has tricks to get food. You can imagine how we are three big mouths, Mamil, Marcel, and me, when we are served. It's the wallet that finds this the funniest, because a 1,000 bill only represents a little more than a kilo of bread. Yesterday, we ate a kilo of cake, which was worth much more than a simple crepe with blackberry jam. It fills the stomach all the same. Speaking of crepes, I decided to make some since a friend gave me some flour. There you go, just a little flour and water with nothing to cook them with. Funny looking crepes. I have to tell you how I got a new work suit yesterday. The work office gave them to us, but you should see me with, just imagine, the heavy fabric to wash like what we had before the war, and the same color. It's made in Poland. All the French here will be wearing the same thing, just like the Russians who got them, so we won't be able to tell each other apart. Let's talk a little bit about the alerts. Our paper, The Brave Echo of Nancy, talks about that. A nice little tale. What a funny farce. Certainly they mistook the planes for crows. At the factory, they told us when the sirens go off, we can do as we please. And you can see how we act like crazy little kids in the country because now they drop a whole bunch and then the letter cuts off. But it is finished on another page. And it ends, my dear little treasure, I will end my letter due to lack of space. Kiss my little daughters for me as well as our dear mother, your big guy who loves you with all his heart and sends you his best love and kisses. Signed, Marcel. So I bet I read that letter 20 times before I understood what he was saying. Imagine when he's talking about making crepes, right? You imagine traditional cooked crepes. He was talking about uncooked flour and water. And what is uncooked flour and water? It's paste. So he was writing, I think, things like that for the benefit of his wife, to provide some sense of comfort to her that he was surviving. So after getting that second translation, I processed what it was, what information did I know from that? So he was writing from a barrack. He mentioned Russians. He was writing from a place called Marienfeld, Germany. I knew that from the address on one of the other letters. He talked about Daimler. He talked about being hungry and having tricks to get food. And if you add up all of those clues, there was one answer, which was that he was working at the Daimler, like the Daimler-Benz company, Daimler-Benz factory in Marienfelde, Germany. And that factory made tanks for the German army. So here he was, a Frenchman, 1,300 kilometers from home, working at a factory making German tanks. And the big question was, why? Why would a Frenchman be making German tanks? So I do research for clients all the time. I'm pretty good at finding stuff online. So I thought, well, I'm just going to type his name into Google and find out what happened to him. And nothing came up. And I spent days trying to find out what happened to Marcel. I thought it was just going to be an easy question to find an answer to. But days turned into weeks, still couldn't find anything on him. And I didn't have much to go on, right? I had an address, but I didn't even know his wife's name because he only ever called her my darling. So I didn't have many clues legitimately. But one thing I learned about was something called the STO. And Shelley, you might know about this since you've studied World War II history. But if you think about what was happening in Germany at the time, so able-bodied, strong men were sent to the Eastern or the Western fronts to fight. But the Germans still needed all of these industrial things to be done and made. And since they didn't have the manpower, they brought people in to do these jobs. And some of the jobs required unskilled labor, but some of the jobs required skilled labor. And the Germans brought people in from occupied countries to do these skilled jobs. So I learned that Marcel had been a metal worker. So he was a tool and die maker. So he was very skilled in and very qualified to be brought in to a factory making tanks, right? And hundreds of thousands of Frenchmen were sent to Germany in collaboration with the Vichy government to go work in these factories, farms, mines, meat canning plants, basically anything that the Germans needed help with. And there were different phases of sending people over. You know, at first they asked for volunteers. And the incentive was that the Germans agreed to release one French prisoner of war for every 3 volunteers. So, at first they were selling it as a very patriotic thing that you could do, but eventually it was just compulsory. And if you received notice that you had to go to Germany, your options were to go to Germany or to become part of the underground. And if you went and became part of the underground, there would be sanctions for your family, such as withholding of food rations. So there were no choices, right? There were no good choices. And by the end of the war, I've seen and read different numbers, but there were up to 2 million Frenchmen who were in Germany. And there were also some French prisoners of war who had their status changed to be a civilian worker. And some of them may have done that because you had a couple benefits of, I say benefits, but you could, for example, you had the right to unlimited correspondence. So if you needed to be in communication with your family, that would be one benefit of becoming a civilian worker versus a prisoner of war. You could also get packages. So if you were starving, you could become a guest worker and receive packages of food from your family. So along the way, I would toggle back and forth between searching for Marcel and gathering more information that would give me more clues on where I could look. So some of the things that I learned, interestingly, these stripes, the blue and red stripes, were not signs of his French national pride. Those weren't the colors of the French flag. Those were censor marks. So his letters were censored by the French or the German officials. But if you think about it, men like Marcel, who worked in factories, had access to incredible military intelligence. So of course, censors would want to know what information he might be sending home. I sent a message to the Daimler Corporation asking if they could help me in my search. And it was one of many emails that it's just like you take a deep breath before you send that email, and then you hit send and you have no idea what's going to happen, right? But I heard back from an archivist in Stuttgart who, at first asked some very kind of terse questions of who was I and why was I asking? But he eventually went into the Daimler archives to look at records of workers that were brought into their labor camp. And he found an entry with Marcel's name at the date that corresponded to the letters. So that was, pretty amazing, right? And it included a date that he left the camp too. So, at first I was like, this is amazing information. But I realized one of the letters that I had been mailed from the camp after that date. So it didn't make sense. So this whole process was getting one more puzzle piece, trying to see what picture emerges, get another puzzle piece, see what picture emerges. So there's a place in Germany called the Arlson Archives. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. But to this day, the German government staffs this archive of all the records of concentration camp detainees, labor camp, displaced people. I found it amazing that the German government to this day staffs that, and research is free. So you can submit a name and ask what records they have for that name. And so I contacted them, and they had records on Marcel too, including a note that he had been transferred to Spandau prison. So the date that Daimler had of Marcel leaving the camp, he had been sent to Spandau prison, and his crime was violating food rules in the labor camp. So this is only speculation on my part, but I believe, based on content of other letters, he was selling food on the black market. So maybe he had been discovered that he was selling food on the black market. Anyway, he ended up going back to the Daimler labor camp. So I reached out to the archivist again. I'm like, hey, do you have a record of him re-entering the camp on this specific day? And he said, I don't know, I'll get back to you, and got back to me. And he said, yes, we have a record of him re-entering the camp on this day, but they had no record of him leaving. And if you think of what was happening in Berlin at the end of the war, it was chaos, records weren't kept. The Russians ended up coming into that factory, dismantling the machines, sending all of those machines back to Russia. So I didn't even know if Marcel had been taken to Russia. I also learned that the United States was involved in multiple bombing raids of the factory, because what would we want to bomb more than a factory making German tanks, right? That's a high value military target. And the civilians who were killed in those kinds of bombing raids were collateral damage. So I had an address in France where his wife and 3 young daughters were. So I did things like scour maps and, try to see what I could find in archives near this tiny little village that had like 275 people. And I even did things like reading transcripts of the Nuremberg forced labor trials to see if there was any mention anywhere of what happened to these French workers. But I couldn't find anything. And the more that I looked for him, the more it just felt like he had been erased from history. And what I tell people is that it hurt my heart to see that he had been erased, because these letters are just so filled with love and affection and tenderness and these fatherly words of advice. But they also include these horrific descriptions of things that were happening inside the labor camp. So these letters have the best and the worst of humanity. And I just became obsessed with finding out what happened to him. So I'm going to read a short excerpt from the book. A couple of nights later, I saw Marcel. It was not the first time I dreamed about the search, but it was the first time I saw him in a dream. He walked ahead of me on a narrow, gravel-covered country road. The back of his thin frame was in sharp focus. The fields and trees in the periphery were modeled like a painting. He wore old trousers, worn brown shoes, rolled up threadbare shirt sleeves pooled around bony elbows. Marcel's arms hung at his sides, swinging slightly as he walked. His hands were empty. I watched and waited for Marcel to glance left or right, hoping to see his profile, but he never wavered from his straight ahead singular focus. I listened for birds or cars, cows or wind, but the only sound that echoed in my ears was the rhythmic crunch of his footsteps. Marcel never broke from his steady pace. Sometimes I lagged behind and had to take running steps to regain my place. Other times I tried walking faster, but no matter what I did, I could not close the distance between us. I tried determining the color of his hair. The conversation with Kathy still undoubtedly on his mind. Was it black, brown, blonde? I could not tell. Colors seemed to shift in the light. Was he tall or short? He was too far ahead to know for sure. I longed for Marcel to turn and extend an invitation for me to join him. I wanted to walk beside him, to hear the timbre of his voice. There were so many questions I wanted to ask, so many things I wanted to know. Somehow in my dream, we would understand each other. I was certain we would somehow speak a common language. But Marcel never noticed I followed behind, or perhaps he did. Either way, deep down, I knew why he did not turn around. Deep in my bones, I understood. I awoke from the dream wrapped in a blanket of sadness, as thick and heavy as the comforter covering me. I lay motionless as I attempted to cement into memory each and every detail: his gait, his swinging arms, his rolled up shirt sleeves, his worn brown shoes. I did not have to work hard to interpret what my subconscious understood with absolute certainty. I was never going to catch up with him. I was never going to find Marcel. So what I tell people is that the universe in this whole experience of this project in the book, the universe meddled at times. And it was shortly after that I actually got in touch with a genealogy researcher. And she was the one who ultimately discovered his fate. So here's a question for you guys, because I never know during presentations like this if people want to know or don't want to know. I mean, I don't, excuse me, I don't want to be one of those people that says you have to buy the book to find out, because I think that's horrible. But I also don't want to ruin the surprise if people want to experience the discovery of the answer while reading the book. So I don't know what to do next.
Yeah.
I mean,
I would love to.
I always read the end of the book first, so clearly I want to know.
Okay, so what I'll say is that for people who don't want to know, look away from the computer for just a minute so I don't ruin the surprise. Okay, so look away if you don't want to know.
Good.
So after learning his fate, I ended up getting in touch with his family in France. And, you know, it was one of many moments in this whole project where, you know, I'm like this crazy American who just reaches out to the, you know, total strangers in France, but saying, hey, I have letters from Marcel. And my hope, well, first of all, I wanted them to read these extraordinary letters or be reunited with them, or, you know, whatever. I had no idea how these letters ended up in Stillwater, Minnesota. But I only knew about him from this very small keyhole of time, 1943, 1944. I didn't know anything else about him. And, you know, I felt like it was unfair to judge his entire life based on this little keyhole. So, you know, I also felt like he was a friend, right? I knew these deep, intimate thoughts. So I reached out to the family in France, got in touch with them. And one of the most remarkable, unexpected things was to actually see a photo of Marcel. So I will share this. So it was remarkable to finally put a face with a name. So the rest of the book talks about my trip to Paris to meet his family. His grandchildren knew he had been in France, but they didn't know where and they didn't know why. It just wasn't talked about. So for them to see these letters, to read these letters, and to see his beautiful handwriting in a font, you know, that would appear letter by letter on my laptop screen as I typed their names. They said it was for them, it was as if I had brought him back to life. So that was the remarkable thing to hear from them. So thank you for listening to the spiel about the book. I would love to answer questions.
Did you find out how they, because that seems weird if he's in France, that the letters end up in a store in Stillwater, Minnesota.
Yep. So they're too happy to share the answer. But if you don't want to know the answer, want to read it in the book, put your computer on mute or something. I have not been able to recreate the entire chain of custody, but the letters were purchased at a flea market in Paris by the owner of the store in Stillwater. And I have theories about how they ended up at the flea market in Paris. But there is a gap in custody that we'll never know.
Yeah, well, it's fortunate, I suppose, that things survive, because so many people just throw stuff out with no regard to what sort of, like, as a historian, it bugs me when people just throw out old letters and photographs and stuff, because they're like, well, I don't know who these people are. It's like, well, somebody might want to know they existed.
Right. And if you think of the fact that his grandchildren, all of this was new to them.
Yeah. So it's sort of, it's good that you were able to find the family.
Yeah.
So what inspired you to go from designing the font to writing a book about your journey?
This experience just consumed more than a year of my life, right? It was the only thing that I thought about. And, not to get into the complicated legal things, but, for a long time, it looked like for the better part of a year, it looked like I could not write the book because of some French privacy law issues. But a friend told me that I had to write all this down to get it out of my system. So that was part of it. But then when I ultimately did have legal permission to share the contents of the letters, it was just like this story. And again, it just felt like the universe was meddling, that it just felt like this story, it was way bigger than me as a person. It was bigger than Marcel even. It was just this story of tenacity and love, and a part of World War II history that not a lot of people know about. I heard from a person who read the book. She lived in Canada. Her father was French. Her father had been one of those young workers who had been sent to Germany. And she didn't know anything about his experience until she read this book. And she's like, it just put so many puzzle pieces together for her as far as what he might have experienced. But she didn't even know much about French forced labor.
Yeah, because I know that, a lot of the people in the concentration camps were used as slaves, where they'd get, the idea was work them to death and then replace them with more. And then there were the political prisoners, the prisoners of war, and then there were calls, especially earlier on, of getting people to come from different countries to Germany to work. So some people were able to save their lives by doing that, including, there's actually a couple of Jewish people who were able to use false papers and lie and work in Germany as a volunteer from their country, pretending not to be Jewish.
Oh, interesting. So they went to a labor camp to avoid a concentration camp.
Right, or a death camp. Yeah, because there were three kinds.
Yeah, interesting.
People say the camps, but there were multiple types, and labor camps were different than concentration camp. Death camps were like solely for the purpose of killing as many people as possible.
Right.
So they were different gradations. So, but it is always fascinating to find that it was a lot more complex.
Right. And workers like Marcel, I found it really interesting, were paid. But from their pay, they had deductions for food and housing, and they had to rent their clothes. But even still, they did have some money. So they were better off because they could buy and sell things on the black market. So they had access to more food that other people in, like the Russians in the labor camps, didn't have that. So they weren't able to buy food on the black market. So yeah, when he mentioned a friend from Amiens who had tricks to get food, that all plays into that.
Yeah.
Workers like Marcel were able to send money home, but the Germans were in charge of exchange rates. So I don't know that he was able to send much money home.
Yeah, I would imagine any little helped.
Right, exactly.
Because yeah, I just interestingly watched a documentary on like the difference between Free France and Vichy France, and how different people were faring, and all the complexities during the war, because they were different than some other countries that were completely taken over, is that they had a government that collaborated with the Nazis.
Right.
And were any of Marcel's children alive, or were the family able to help you fill in any gaps?
One of his daughters is still alive. One passed away in, I think it was September 2020, so pretty recent. And for sure, they were able to tell me a ton of stories about who he had been. At that point, I had the basic statistics of his life, right? So that information didn't come from them, but to be able to tell me stories that confirmed who I believed him to be based on reading his extraordinary letters. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, they must have been happy to get them back.
I think they were just surprised, like where did these come from, and who is this crazy American?
Were those the letters that you bought, all the letters that were there at the thrift store, or you just bought 5 of them?
I only bought 5 of them because I figured that was all I needed for the font. And there were a whole bunch more in the store. And I cannot tell you how I kicked myself and berated myself for not buying every single letter. But I mean, who knew, right? I didn't know the significance of the content of the letters. And I only bought what I felt like I needed for the font.
Were they gone? Did you go back to see if you could find more, or were they gone? Or
well, 9 years later, by the time I had the first letter translated, the store was long closed.
Yeah.
No. Yes.
Does anybody have any questions? A lot of times we ask authors, like, what was their methodology, when you were writing. So you said you were writing to sort of get it all out, but when you decided you wanted to do something with it or whatever, what was your process for writing the book?
Well, I've never written anything of note before. So even when I was writing to get things out, I didn't think anybody was ever actually going to read it. So when the concept of an official book first came out, I didn't think I was qualified to write it. I didn't know how to write a book. I only knew one person who had ever published a book. I didn't know the first thing. Again, didn't think I was qualified. So my thought was, I don't know who's writing this book, but it's not me. But what I'll do is I will put things down so they're factually accurate, so the dates are right, and the people are right, assuming that at some point I was going to turn it over to someone else. And then I eventually kind of had the whole thing blocked out, but still thinking I was going to have somebody else write it. And then I had, the whole first chapter written, still thinking somebody else would write it. And then I had 3 chapters written, still not knowing who the heck was going to write this book. And then I had 5 chapters written. And then eventually it's like, I have a book and this is kind of terrifying. But in hindsight, maybe that was good because there was no pressure to write a book, because I just always assumed somebody else was writing the book. at the time that everything was happening, because I didn't, first of all, expect it to be significant, right? I mean, this whole thing just began as a side project and a curiosity. I didn't take notes as far as what happened where, or what happened when, rather. So a big part of the project, which actually took a couple of months, was just recreating the timeline of events with accuracy. And thankfully, a lot of things happened by email. A lot of the people that I got in contact with was all by email. So I could identify, what day did I establish contact with the translator? What day did I establish contact with the archivist in Stuttgart? When did I, do X, Y, and Z? And I was really, really careful to recreate that with accuracy. But at the beginning of the book, like the chapter says August. So there were things that I know that happened in August, but I don't know specifically if it was August 12th or August 14th, whereas later on, there was more documentation about what happened when. But I tried to be very careful about all the details, and I'll give you one example. So in the book, there is a scene where I'm having dinner with two other women, the genealogy researcher and our common friend. So we went to Meritage in St. Paul, and it's a fantastic French restaurant in St. Paul. If somebody thinks of a French restaurant in St. Paul, they're going to think of Meritage. It's not named in the book, but that's where we went. And I reached out to Kathy and Dixie and just sent them an email. I'm like, hey, do you guys remember what you ate for dinner? Because I wanted to be accurate about it, right? And Dixie remembers she ate some kind of fritter and Kathy couldn't remember. So it was at the time when people were still posting pictures of food on social media, like, hey, look at what I had for lunch. Oh, those early innocent days of social media. But I knew I had photos of our dinners. And so I contacted the chef owner of the restaurant and sent him the photos and asked him to identify what it is that we ate that night. So then in the book, I can say, Kathy had rabbit saddle and Dixie had potato fritters. And, I knew that I had fish. And so I tried to be very diligent about being factually accurate. And of course, when the chef got my email too, he probably was yet another person that thought, who's this crazy person that's contacting me?
Although I'm sure if people had pictures, there's times where I've had meals and I wanted to get back to them and go, wait, I can't stop thinking about it. What was it? How do you make it?
Right. And we, my husband and I went to that restaurant after the book came out, and the chef owner was there that night. And so I, asked to speak to him, and I brought him a book, and I'm like, do you remember me? I'm the crazy one that sent you the email. I was like, oh, I remember you. But the what you see here behind me and on the cover of the book, that is the font based on Marcel's handwriting. So to the degree that I could, it very accurately, as accurate as possible with the constraints of a computer font, captures the essence of his handwriting.
That's cool.
It is just a beautiful font.
Marcel gets the credit for that. I did learn something pretty interesting. We have a little bit of time yet that I can tell you this story. So I met with a woman who was in her 90s, born and raised in France, and she saw his handwriting. I think I brought some of the samples for her to see. And this was after the book came out, so it's not in the book, but she said, oh, well, that's blue collar handwriting. You know that, right? I'm like, no, I didn't know that. But she said at that time in France, at a pretty young age, students were tracked either into an academic track where they would become a doctor, a lawyer, a priest, or they would be tracked into like more of a manual labor kind of track where they would work until the age of 13, 14, 15, and then become an apprentice to a trade. And the two tracks learn different kinds of handwriting. And she said that this was classic blue collar handwriting, but she did note that his spelling and grammar was exceptional. So she presumed that he grew up in a family of readers, that he would have, had access to books and newspapers. But I found that fascinating because, to me, in my opinion, this is really fancy, beautiful handwriting, but it was considered very common at the time.
Wow. Yeah, well, it makes sense because if he was working in a factory making tanks because of his tool and die experience, then
Exactly.
he would have been in the trades.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. And I think Europe still was doing that after the war as well, because I remember learning about when I was taking German classes, they would talk about how at a certain point in school, you moved into your different tracks. And so most of your education was actually before college. If you went to college, it was more about formal training and making connections.
Yes, and I've met with a whole bunch of different book clubs, and there was one woman, and I want to say even in England, they did that into the 1960s, which I was really surprised to hear. But she said even then, because she had been also tracked into this more blue collar track.
Yeah.
Which I found fascinating.
But yeah, it looks like calligraphy. I couldn't write that nice. And, there's a whole generation, like Gillette's sons are of a generation where, stick shift cars and cursive writing will completely shut them down.
Right. I tell people cursive is like, it's like secret code for older people, right? That just can't read it.
How to write notes to your spouse that your children can't read.
Right. So Lena, let me ask a question for you. With the Wadena County Historical Society, do you guys have programs on either genealogy or letters, or do you guys have in your archive a repository of letters from the county? Oh,
You're on mute.
And no, not really. And actually, it was Gillette that brought this book to my attention. And it just caught my interest because of the connection with World War II and a little known part of it, cover. In my past life, I worked with veteran stories. And so it was particularly interesting. This one, and I'm looking. Though I wanted to know the end, I am going to read it. I already got the copy.
I promise there will still be surprises for you in the book.
Oh, just learning the story, and I remember and what you said about this person saying, "Oh, I knew what my father maybe had gone through." Reading this book, that was one of the things that I was very happy to find out with the Veterans Museum, is that people would come to me and say, "Oh, now I know what my father experienced, or what my mother experienced, or whatever that like that." And that's, I think, the whole purpose of history, is to not just let it die there, but bring it to life and let people still participate in it.
And I think that's also one reason that local historical societies are so important too, because all those local artifacts, once they are gone, the history of the land, the history of the people, all of that is gone unless there are caretakers like you. So congratulations.
Well, it is an honorable profession, I think. And fortunately, a lot of people are interested in doing it. And the State Historical Society supports that kind of thing, and the National Societies, because we have to work together to maintain this whole collective unconscious and history. I think it's exciting.
Yep,
for sure.
Yeah, like when Gillette and I met we were actually in a history class together in college. That's how we met. 30 years ago.
Oh my gosh, that's fantastic.
And and it was social history, and a lot of the stuff too is, people find diaries or letters and things like this, because you realize so much of what was really going on was hidden. Like when I didn't care for, I mean, I loved stories, but I didn't care too much for history as it was taught in school, because it was sort of like memorizing all these white guys and their wars and their treaties and their elections. And you're like, but how did people, I'd see the pictures or the paintings or the artifacts, and I was more curious, like, well, how were people like us living, like ordinary people, not, George Washington and stuff, but what were like regular everyday people's lives like in the 1600s and 1700s, different periods. And it's almost sort of sad that the things that are most likely to tell us disappear, because nobody thinks to save somebody's letters or somebody's diaries or the pictures or the items, and so much went hidden that made the world go round. So it's sort of nice when someone like yourself finds this and then shares it with us.
Well, and I hope readers are inspired, because I am just a graphic designer who likes type, right? I'm not a historian, I'm not a researcher, but I think it just takes anybody finding something that is of interest and then being curious and spending a little time digging around. But I am the first to say there is nothing that made me particularly qualified to uncover this story.
There's an important thing that made you qualified, and that is the passion for discovering it.
Yes, the curiosity.
The curiosity.
That's the best. That's the best. That's what.
Some people would just find those letters and be like, I just needed the fonts. I got what I needed, and then throw them out, not even get them translated.
Right.
So the fact that you were curious enough to get one translated and then another and then another, and then one thing led to another, and now you have the book.
Yeah. And, I think unless I had spent all that time looking at the intricacies of, the crossbar on his T's or the loop on his G's, if I hadn't spent that time, I probably honestly wouldn't have been that curious either. But I guess the point of entry to history is a little bit different for everybody.
Well, exactly. It's what you're interested in, and then it just takes off from there.
Right.
Thank you so much. You've done a great job to preserve this history and for the family, but also for the whole world, because now they get to know about it.
Yeah. I'm so happy when people, and I say this sincerely, I'm so happy when people get to meet Marcel, that they get to know him and his wife and his family. And so many people who have read this then say that they feel like family. And honestly, it just gets me. I love it.
Thank you. Great.
What, Gillette, what were you going to say?
And maybe having the book published, more of his letters will come to light.
That is my hope. I mean, I hope. I am not holding my breath, but if that happens, I also, it is not out of the realm of possibility. So I remain hopeful.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it would be interesting to find out what the person who owned that store did with all the inventory that might have been left when he closed down.
Well, some of that might be in the book.
So we'll have to read to find out.
Well, and thank you, Gillette, too, for bringing the book to Lena's attention. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Absolutely. It had the word font in it. And I love the fonts.
I love hearing that.
All right. Well, thank you so very much for joining us. And we're hoping in the future, the summer, Lina, to bring the authors to an event in Wadena so people can come and meet them in person and get books signed.
We hope so.
Let me know, reach out, and hopefully the pandemic will be over and it'll be safe for people to gather.
Yes.
That'll be
We'll
great.
hope for that.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so very much. And I'm looking forward to reading the book and finding out all the rest of the answers to those questions.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks.